Namaskar. Today we move further with module 2, and in the previous session on module 2, which was session 1 module 2, we had started with and begun to discuss market research and consumer behavior. So, we basically tried to relate market research and consumer behavior with each other, and we spoke about the relevance of market research with consumer behavior. We spoke about the various approaches to consumer behavior research. We also discussed the various research perspectives and research paradigms in consumer behavior. Today we will move with the next session under module 2, which is session 2 of module 2, and we will be discussing the consumer research process. So, to begin with consumer research process. Now, as we have discussed earlier, marketers need to have knowledge about the environment in which they operate. This environment could be both at the micro level as well as at the macro level. So, market research basically focus on the study of consumer and his environment, and here consumer research focuses on the consumer and his consumption behavior. So, we have seen that as market research focuses on the study of the consumer and the environment, consumer research basically focuses on the study of the consumer and his consumption patterns. Companies could conduct market research through services of their in-house marketing information systems, or they could outsource this activity to outside consultants and or market research consultants. But it is very imperative that companies undertake this process or go through this entire activity called consumer research, because it is very essential that you understand the consumer and his consumption process. Now, the consumer research process, its consumption pattern, can actually be studied as a 5-staged procedure. Now, as we move on, mind you, please remember that the various stages which we will speak of are not mutually exclusive. Neither they are they essentially sequential, okay. But for purposes of ease, for purposes of convenience, we basically speak of this process as a 5-stage process. I am repeating this: the various stages are neither sequential in nature nor are they mutually exclusive. In fact, in most cases they happen in parallel and they work together. These various activities which we will speak of are being taken over, are being conducted in parallel to each other. So, what are these 5 stages? Let us study these 5 stages. The 5 stages are: first, define the problem or the research objective. So, we need to very clearly specify what is the problem and what is the research objective. Next, we just have to decide and develop the research plan. So, research plan will basically focus on how are we going to go about this particular process, how are we going to actually solve or study this problem, how are we going to basically attain our research objectives. So, the research plan will be a broad framework to help us plan ourselves better, so that we move properly in conducting of consumer research. After this, we move to collecting data, which could be primary data as well as secondary data, then analyze the data, and then finally prepare a report and present the findings to the stakeholders. So, this is in general the consumer research process, and we will study this process in this sequence, but as I said, this is not essentially sequential in nature, and all of these stages are in fact interrelated to each other, and none of them acts an exclusive or in watertight compartment. Now, let us start with the research process, and we will speak about first the stage which is defining the problem and stating the research objectives. So, while going in for consumer research, the marketer has to first define the research problem. What does the research problem speak of? It says what is the problem, what are the various issues, what is the kind of information that is needed. So, basically through a research problem, the marketer would actually discuss in terms, decide for himself what is the problem, what are the various issues which I have to deal with, and what is the kind of information that is required. All of this actually defines what we call as a research objective. Now, research can be conducted to solve problems or fight threats once the problem has arisen. Okay. So, in that sense we may say that it's more to do with an active state of mind. You engage yourself in consumer research once the problem has already happened. Okay, once a threat has already been identified. So, there is something called the AS type or the actual state type. In the AS type or the actual state type, the market researcher or the consumer researcher basically faces a problem or suffers a setback in market or has a very big problem that he has to address, and he goes in for study of the market, he goes in for understanding the market, understanding consumers after this problem has arisen or after a threat has been identified. So, it is more active in nature and it is called an actual state or an AS type. On the other hand, research may also be conducted to identify opportunities or fight threats that are foreseen. So, you could undertake research activity before a problem has arisen. You could try to go in for a research activity to identify opportunities, to fight the various threats. So, here you are being more proactive in nature, and such a problem or such a problems type is referred to as a DS type or a desired state type. So, problems essentially could be of two kinds, the AS type and the DS type. Let us discuss this further with the help of an example. For example, just assume you are the Vice President Marketing and Sales. Your company produces paper products and stationery and has been a market leader since a long time. Of late, there have been concerns about environmental protection and recycling. The market is sensitive towards environmental issues and the people are getting very conscious. Now, what happens, So, if we study this as an AS type, okay, AS type here, actual state problem solving, you are going to act after the problem has occurred. So, let us say the action is you fail to read the pulse of the market, another company enters the scene with a recyclable paper and stationery products. The effect is you begin to lose sales and thereby market share to this new entrant who is selling recyclable paper. Now, you feel that a problem has occurred and you need to act now. So, you are being very reactive in your approach. So, you go in for a consumer study or a consumer research. On the other hand, let us take the same scenario, same assumption of and move further with the desired state type. In the desired state type or the desired state problem solving, you act before the problem has occurred. So, the action here is you realize that you need to adhere to regulatory norms, you need to be very sensitive to the environment, you have to be very you have to think about environmental considerations. So, the effect is you prepare to introduce recycled paper products, you go for consumer research to understand the probable consumer reaction to such products. So, you are being proactive. So, here we have a state where in the same problem as a vice president of a company, marketing and sales, you are producing paper and stationery, and you see in your environment, you read in your environment that there are concerns about environmental protection and recycling or using recyclable products. And here one approach could be you sit tight, you sit quiet, do not do anything, and then suddenly you realize that another company has entered the market and with recyclable paper and stationery products, and the market, which is already growing very sensitive and growing very conscious to this with the environment, decides to go in, switch over the buyer behavior and move to another brand rather than continuing with your brand. So, here a problem has already occurred and you need to react. So, it is more of a reactive state. So, then you decide to go in for a consumer study. So, it is an actual state type. On the other hand, you realize you understand that because the environment is getting very conscious, people are getting very conscious, and there are a lot of concerns with respect to the environment and environmental protection. So, and you realize that you will have to adhere to rules, regulations and the law. So, you on your own decide to prepare yourself for production, for manufacture of recyclable paper products, and you go in for a consumer research to be able to understand what the consumption behavior will be, how people will react to your product. And so, in this type of a situation, you are basically acting, you are basically being you are being proactive. Okay. So, this is the difference between the actual state type of a problem and a desired state problem. Okay. Now, research problems should be conceptualized and the objectives should be very, very well defined. In fact, you should be very clear about the reasons as to why the research is being undertaken. Okay. Until unless you are clear about what you have to do, you won't be able to move further. So, you have to basically conceptualize the problem and define the objectives of the study very carefully. Now, such objectives should neither be too narrowly defined nor should they be too broadly defined. There should be something which should be quite good enough for you to proceed, neither very narrow nor very broad, neither very narrow in scope or very extensive in scope. It should be something which you should be able to carry out and come up with good results. Now, the objectives of the study could be any one or more of the following. When you go in for consumer research, your research objectives could be either explanation or prediction or insight generation and discovery or hypothesis, testing of hypothesis or monitoring of the market environment. So, when your objectives basically could be in the form of explanation or prediction or insight generation or testing of hypothesis or general monitoring of the environment. Depending upon what your objective is, whether it is explanation, prediction, insight generation, testing of hypothesis or monitoring of the environment, the researcher will decide to go in for either a qualitative study or a quantitative study. So, let us speak about these different types of research objectives with the help of some examples. Explanation. So, what does explanation do? Explanation here explains reasons for occurrence of a phenomena and tries to identify reasons for such an occurrence. So, what do we mean by explanation? Explanation is going to explain events and identify the reasons for such occurrences. Okay. So, let us take an example for sudden fall in the sales of gold jewelry at Tanishq, especially when prices of gold have been stable in the world market. So, for example, if there is a fall in the sales at gold jewelry at Tanishq when price of gold have been fairly stable and suddenly there is a fall in the prices of gold at Tanishq. So, you need to explain why it has happened, what could be the reasons of the occurrence, what could be the reasons of fall in sales of gold jewelry at Tanishq. So, this is an example where this actually exemplifies the explanation objective. What is the explanation objective? It is going to explain events and identify the reasons of the occurrence. The second objective is prediction. So, what does prediction do? Prediction basically predicts occurrence of events in future. How will events shape up in future? What will happen in future? How can you forecast your sales patterns? How could you forecast your revenue patterns? So, for example, if you want to study the sales forecast of a new brand of Amul chocolates, you are basically talking of prediction. Okay. So, in prediction you are basically to go in, your basic focus is forecasting. The third objective is insight generation and discovery. When we speak of insight generation discovery, the main objective here is to gain newer insights. Okay, it could be newer insights into problems, newer insights into some event, issues or newer insights into some kind of a phenomena. Okay. So, if for example, there is a study which is carried out to look out for newer segments or newer markets for a current product, that means if you want to actually go in for a market development, in that case you will be going into research with an objective of insight generation and discovery. So, basically insight generation and discovery helps us to gain newer insights, gain newer ideas about how people will actually react. So, this is the third objective, which is insight. Another objective while we are undertaking consumer research could be in the form of testing of hypothesis. So, a hypothesis may be formulated where they may be which may refer to a relationship between two variables, and or it may be a relationship between two events. So, you just try and find out how the relationship which you have established, which you have hypothesized, will turn out to be a true or will it turn out to be false. So, this kind of testing of hypothesis can also be an objective in research. For example, if you want to test the relationship between the price of a Sony plasma and the consumer perception of the brand or quality, you're basically going in for testing of hypothesis. If I say that yes, Sony Plasma is expensive, but it is perceived to be a good brand, and if I want to test both the public reaction or consumer reaction with respect to what they have to they say about the price of the product as well as how they perceive the brand or the quality of the product, I will be actually going in for testing of the hypothesis. The last objective or consumer with which consumer research may be undertaken is monitoring of marketing environment. That means identifying opportunities and threats, trying to assess your own self monitoring, trying to assess your own self in absolute terms, in absolute performance terms, also trying to assess yourself in relative terms, in terms of your performance vis-a-vis the competitors. So, in both cases basically you are actually monitoring the marketing environment, you are identifying opportunities, you are identifying threats, you are also identifying strengths and weaknesses. So, when you do that, you are basically moving with an objective of monitoring the environment. You are studying the consumer, or you are studying into consumer research with the objective of studying the market environment. For example, a study aimed at one's own self assessment of performance, or customer awareness and attitude towards your product, or scope for newer segments. All of these will actually fall within the purview of the monitoring of the marketing environment. So, here I have spoken about the different kinds of research objectives with which a marketer could proceed towards research. Now, let us move to something else which is more relevant to us, which is in terms of research studies. Now, there are a number of research studies which can be conducted. Research studies may be descriptive in nature, they could be exploratory in nature, they could be causal, they could be studies which relate to correlation, or they could be studies which are purely experimental. So, when we speak about descriptive, when we speak about exploratory, and when we speak about causal research, they are more relevant, or they are more important ones to a marketer. Now, the decision as to which type of research study a marketer would go in for, or a researcher would go in for, will basically depend upon the research objective. Sometimes for different phases of the same research or the same project, you may have to go in for different research types. So, it is not that one would be one would serve all purposes. Sometimes you may in the same project or in the same study, you may require 2 or 3 different types of research studies. Okay. So, let us now speak of these research studies with examples. So, descriptive research studies. Now, descriptive research studies are the most commonly used type of research. Basically, they help you ascertain the degree, the extent, or the magnitude of occurring events or phenomena and variables under study, and it also helps you identify the causes of such occurrence. So, basically what does it do? It helps you first ascertain or determine the degree, the magnitude, or the extent to which certain events have occurred, and then find out the why such things have happened. So, it basically helps you describe the characteristics of the variable under study and helps you in testing of hypothesis. The kind research design is highly structured and formatted. The methodology used is in terms of surveys, interviews and observation. And for example, if a person wants to study the market potential of notebooks in terms of laptops, electronic notebooks or laptops, we are actually speaking of a descriptive study. So, what would, in a nutshell, if you say, what does a descriptive study help you in? Descriptive study will help you first ascertain the extent, the magnitude, or the degree to which a particular thing or a particular thing has happened, or an event has occurred, and why such events have occurred, or why such things have happened. So, they are basically very structured in nature, very structured and well focused, well formatted, and essentially they use in terms of their methodology, they use interviews, they use observation, they use questionnaires, and if you want to study the market potential of a refrigerator, of a laptop, you are basically trying to speak about descriptive studies. So, you are going to see the extent and the magnitude of something, and why is it happening or why is it not happening. So, these are descriptive studies. The second kind of study is exploratory study. Now, this objective of an exploratory study is to gain insight and deeper understanding of the object of study, the person, situation, etc. Okay. So, here it is basically aimed at going deeper to find out the nature of the problem and suggest alternate solutions, possible solutions. This kind of a study helps us formulate hypotheses. Research design is highly flexible, highly dynamic, and is developed as one is going through the research study. Methodology includes surveys, interviews, observations, focus group interviews, case studies. And for example, if you want to study consumer likes or preferences or attitude towards electronic goods, you are basically saying that you are going in for an exploratory kind of a study. So, what does an exploratory type of a study help us do? The basic objective in a nutshell, if you want to say, is to gain deeper insights into understanding of certain objects or events or situations. Why is something happening, and why going deeper into understanding the nature of the problem and the causes underlying the problem, and then of course coming up with possible solutions. So, basically try to find out and discuss the nature of the problem and then suggest alternative solutions to the problem. A methodology used is in terms of questionnaires, surveys, observation, focus group interviews, case studies also. And for example, if you want to study consumer preference, consumer attitude, consumer like or dislike towards a particular product, maybe electronic goods or maybe apparel wear, clothing, all that will be a part of an exploratory study. The third kind of research study which you can undertake is causal. Okay, so this here causal tries to study the relationship between two variables. Okay, there is an independent variable and the dependent variable. So, the cause is the independent variable and the effect is the dependent variable. So, such causal studies basically are intended to test the relationship between cause and effect. Such causal studies are undertaken for testing of hypotheses. The methodology used is surveys. For example, if you want to study the impact of different advertising appeals on the sales of a product, we are basically talking of a causal study. So, what do causal studies help us? Causal studies basically help us test and establish relationships between two variables, between two types of variables, independent and dependent. So, while the independent is the cause, the dependent is the effect. If you want to study the impact of different kinds of advertising appeals on consumer sales of a product, you are basically talking of cause and effect studies or causal studies. Methodology which is used is surveys. The next which we come to is correlation. Now, correlation basically tries to analyze as to whether a relationship exists between two variables, and if so, what is the degree, if so, what is the degree of such relationship. The relation may not always be a causal one. Okay, correlation does not always imply causation. So, whenever two variables are related, it is not essentially a causal relationship, it is not essentially a cause and effect relationship that is between the two of them, and that is what correlation emphasizes, that any or every kind of relationship between two variables need not always be causal. The correlation studies generally imply that any relationship between variables need not always be causal. The next kind of research study which we speak of is correlation. Now, in correlation studies, basically the purpose is to analyze whether a relationship exists between two variables or not, and if there is a relationship, to what degree or to what magnitude does this relationship exist. Now, the basic assumption with which we move here is that relationship between two variables may not always be a causal one. Okay. So, correlation basically says that any and every kind of relationship need not always be causal, and correlation does not always imply causation. So, basically what we speak of is a relationship between two variables, and does a relationship exist, and if it exists, what is the magnitude of this relationship. Now, correlation studies are basically used for testing of hypothesis. The methodology which is generally used is in form of surveys. So, if you want to study the relationship between the change of season and the sale of products, it would be a correlation study in terms of correlation. So, basically when we speak about correlation, it is a study which analyzes whether relationship exists between variables, and if this relationship exists, what is the level or what is the degree of such relationships. The methodology used is essentially surveys, and the example could be if a relationship between change of season and the sale of certain kinds of products. So, this is what we mean by correlation. The last kind of a study which we speak of is experimental. Now, similar to causal research in terms of establishing a cause and effect relationship among the group of subjects. So, experimental studies are very similar to causal research. They establish a cause and effect relationship between the group of subjects, but here the cause or the independent variable is under the control of the researcher. So, this is the difference between a cause and effect or a causal research study and an experimental research study. In a causal research study, it establishes a cause and effect relationship. Experimental research studies also establish a cause and effect relationship, but the difference between the two is that independent variable or the causal variable is supposed to be under the control of the researcher. Now, this is again used for testing of hypothesis, and methodology used is in terms of surveys, interviews and observation. For example, if you want to study consumer reactions to 4 different varieties of a breakfast cereal, you are actually talking of an experimental kind of a research study. So, here we move, we finish off or we conclude with the first stage in the consumer research process, which is problem recognition or defining the problem or research objectives. So, first thing what you do is defining research objectives, and while defining research objectives, I have spoken about the actual state, the desired state, types of problems. I have also spoken about the various types of research objectives, which could be explanation, prediction, insight generation, hypothesis testing and monitoring of environment. And then we have moved on to study different types of research studies, which could be descriptive, exploratory, causal, correlational and experimental. So, now let us move to the next stage in the consumer research process, which is the developing the research plan. So, once a problem has been conceptualized, once a problem has been properly defined and in specific terms, the researcher now has to develop a research plan. So, how does the researcher develop this research plan? He will have to decide on a few composites. He will have to think of certain constituents in the research plan, which are number 1, what will be his data sources, what would be the research tools and techniques, what will be the sampling plan, and what would be the contact methods for data collection. So, the research plan basically comprises 4 constituents, and these constituents are in terms of the data sources, the research tools, the research techniques, the sampling plan and the contact methods for data collection. Now, we will go by one, we will discuss all of these 4 constituents of the research plan. The first constituent is data sources. Okay. So, there are 2 kinds of data sources, primary sources and secondary sources. A researcher can either use one of them or both of them. Generally speaking, the researcher starts with a secondary data source and then he moves on to primary sources. So, secondary data generally provides a basis or a starting point for primary research. So, what is primary research and what is secondary research? So, let us discuss. Primary research is data which is collected freshly for a specific research study. Okay. It is collected via research instruments, tools and techniques specially designed for the research problem and could be in the form of questionnaires or interviews or observations. So, the advantage of primary sources is that it is more specific to the research problem, more pertinent, more relevant to the research problem, and disadvantages of primary sources are that they are very costly in terms of time and money. So, data which is collected by the researcher on his own comprises what we call primary data, and it could be in the form of questionnaires or interviews or observation. It is more relevant, more specific to the research problem, and so it is that is actually one of the advantages of this kind of a study, but this kind of a data source. But then the problem with this kind of a data source is that it's time consuming and it's very, very expensive. So both in terms of money as well as in terms of time, it's costlier. So this is what primary data sources are. Now we come to secondary data sources. Now when we talk of secondary data sources, this is data which already exists. It could exist in books, journals, reports, or it could just be part of CD-ROMs, online databases, or the internet. So such data could be either in the form of paper sources or electronic sources. Secondary data is data which has been collected earlier by studies conducted earlier. It's a collection of reports or books or journals or knowledge base which was created by researchers earlier. It was collected by studies conducted earlier, and it is something which is not gathered for purposes of the current research. It is something which was gathered for previously for prior studies by other researchers. So data collected by other researchers or for any kind of prior studies which have been undertaken actually comprise what we call the secondary sources. Secondary sources or secondary data is actually obtained through as we said, books or journals or CD-ROMs. So it could also be in the form of published data and reports. Now what are the advantages of secondary sources? The advantage of secondary sources are they are easy to gather, they are readily available. Okay, so they could be easily available through libraries, or it could be through books in libraries, or through CD-ROMs, or on the internet. Readily available and for people to actually refer to. Longitudinal studies may also be possible, and also because reports are published, because it is in the form of published reports and data, that the level of credibility associated with this data or this secondary source is supposed to be higher. However, there is also a disadvantage with this kind of a source. Validity may be always a question, and also this particular study, if it was the information could have been relevant for other studies, but may not be relevant for this kind of a study. Also, the sources of data need to be very legitimate. So these are certain problems with respect to secondary data. So as we said, secondary data is data which was collected or which has been in collection for long by previous researchers who have dealt with similar problems or similar issues. This information is available through electronic sources or through paper sources, even through published reports, through published data. And the advantages are that they are easy to refer to, they are readily available, longitudinal studies are also possible, but the problem with this is that the source you have to be very careful that the source is legitimate, and there could be always problems with the validity of the data that has been collected and the findings that have been shown in such secondary reports. So this is a secondary sources. So this is a problem with secondary sources. Now we come to the second constituent or second component of the research plan. So the second component of the research plan is research tools and techniques. The researcher has to clearly specify what are the tools, what are the techniques that he is going to use. Now in the case of primary data, the major techniques which are used are surveys. Now these surveys could be either questionnaire based surveys or could be in the form of interviews conducted. Apart from surveys, the other techniques that are used in primary data are focus group interviews, observation, as well as behavioral measures and experiments. Now these generally used questionnaires, all of these methods generally use questionnaires which may either be structured or may be unstructured. But when we speak of secondary data, in case of secondary data, the researcher could access company reports, both published and unpublished, industry reports, trade journals, government reports, research articles, magazines, journals, books, CD-ROMs, internet, online basis. So if we see, in case of primary data, we are speaking about quantitative data, and so quantitative data here comes in the form of questionnaires and experimentation. And when we speak about qualitative data, again qualitative data could actually come from questionnaires, case studies and observations. So these are the various kinds of research tools and techniques which are used. We will discuss them a little more now when we speak about the techniques of collecting primary data. So, what are the various techniques of collecting primary data? We start with survey research. Most commonly used technique for data collection, conducted over a large sample to basically learn about consumer liking, consumer awareness, consumer preferences for brands or products. They could be also undertaken to measure customer satisfaction. Conducted over a sample, the findings could be generalized to the entire population. So, naturally, when we are going to speak of the, when a researcher wants to conduct a survey on a small sample and when he wants to generalize it to the entire population, it is very important that the sample that he chooses is chosen with care. The sample should be something which is adequate, it should be appropriate, and it should be truly representative. The major instrument which is used in survey research is questionnaires. Of course, interview techniques may also be used. Example is, for example, if you want to conduct a survey to test consumer awareness or consumer reaction about a new advertisement campaign, you will go in for survey research to collect primary data. So, surveys, as we said, are most commonly used form of for collecting primary data. They could be undertaken to study consumer liking, preference, awareness, or attitude towards brand. They could also be conducted to find out or assess consumer satisfaction with respect to product offering on a brand. They are generally conducted over small samples and then the findings are generalized over larger populations. So, it is very important that the sample is chosen with care and it should be appropriate, it should be adequate, and it should be truly representative. The major instrument that is used in survey research is in the form of questionnaires. Interview technique may also be used, and if you want to study consumer awareness or consumer reaction about a new advertisement campaign, you basically go in for a survey research. So, basically this is what we mean by survey research. Now, let us move to focus group research. Another way by which you gather primary data is through focus group research. As the name suggests, this kind of a research is conducted over a group of people who are your prime focus, and there is a moderator who actually kind of monitors the discussion that takes place and moderates the same as and when required. The moderator focuses on a group of people which could number anywhere between 6 to 10. They are very carefully chosen based on demographic, psychographic or behavioral considerations. The members who are chosen are asked questions about, say for example, the product or the price or the place or anything about the ad campaign. The group members basically are asked questions about the marketing mix or any other issues related to the marketing problem through discussions, amongst themselves. Through discussions that take place amongst the group members, the moderator is able to gain insight into the group members' emotions, feelings, attitudes, and underlying motivation, interests, etc. These sessions are recorded for further analysis, and the technique, for example, is very commonly used for pre-testing before a particular product is finally launched in the market. So, if you want to study why customers prefer a high priced branded electronic good as compared to a lower priced local one, you could basically go in for a focus group kind of a research activity. So, in a nutshell, when we talk about focus group, basically we are talking about a small research being conducted over a small group of people, and a particular issue is discussed which could relate to any or all of the 4 P's or the marketing program or the marketing mix. And amongst discussions, while the group is discussing the either of the 4 P's or the problem or the topic, while the topic is being discussed, any of the identified issue or topic is being discussed, the moderator and the marketer here would be able to gain insights into what is going on in the consumer's mind, what is his insight, what are underlying motivations, what are liking, preferences, attitudes, etc. The third kind of research which we go on is observational research. In observational research, the research technique is basically based on observing people. Through observing people, you gain an insight and in-depth understanding about how people behave in the marketplace by just observing them, by just carefully watching them buy the products. So, basically the consumption pattern is observed, and by looking at customer verbal and non-verbal reactions to product offerings or price increase or decrease or store layout or store ambience or advertisements, etc., you basically are able to come up with conclusions with respect to consumer behavior or consumption patterns. So if you want to study why do customers ask for competitors' brand rather than asking for your brand, you're basically, and you want to observe them in a marketplace or in a shop, you're basically going in for a study which is a observational research. Behavioral measures are also used to collect data. Customer reactions are interpreted through customer databases and score scanning data. The customers' actual responses in terms of purchase are recorded. The assumption here which is there is that there is always a difference between customers' intention to buy and customers' actual purchase. So the focus here is on the actual purchase. How does he actually behave with respect to a product or service offering while he is thinking of purchase? So we speak about, so this particular behavior is recorded and analyzed. Finally, we speak of experimental research. In experimental research, basically we study the cause and effect relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. Here, as we said, the settings are controlled where the sample is treated as a test group. The variables in the study are altered and manipulated, and the reactions of the sample are recorded. So thereafter, these findings are generalized, and this type of research technique is very time consuming, but it's a very scientific and very valid and very reliable approach towards solving many problems. So again, this is also something which is used for pre-testing of the product before launch. Studying consumer reaction due to changes in product features or price or advertisement appeal, etc., will actually be a part of experimental research. So here the next component or the next constituent of the research plan will be the sampling plan. So the researcher basically needs to prepare the sampling plan. What is a sample? A sample is the part of the population or the universe that is chosen to represent the whole. And what is sampling? Sampling is the process by which a sample is chosen. So when we talk of a sampling plan, there are three main constituents of a sampling plan: the sampling unit, the sampling size, and the sampling procedure. So what is the sampling unit? Sampling unit here is what is going to be my basic unit for study. That means who am I going to survey? Okay, so sampling unit is the element that could be considered to be chosen in the sample. It is the basic unit of study. Let us take an example. A research study to conduct the causal relationship between tooth decay and the use of Colgate toothpaste. Okay, so what is the relationship here? And the study here is use of Colgate toothpaste and tooth decay. So population here will be school going children aged 4 to 12 years. They are the entire population of the universe. Now target population is, if we restrict this study to the city of Delhi, then all the children aged 4 to 12 staying in the city of Delhi, studying in schools in Delhi, are actually going to be a part of the target population. And if we speak about the sampling unit, then any child from a school in Delhi between the age of 4 to 12 years would be the sampling unit. So here the population is very broad, which is all the children within the age of 4 to 12. The target population is because we limit our scope of the study to Delhi, so all of the children in the age group 4 to 12 in the city of Delhi would be the target population, and the sampling unit would be any child studying in a school in Delhi between the age of 4 to 12. Second thing is sample size. Now very important, something which is of very, very great importance to the researcher is the question that what should be my sample size. Data collection is something which is very, very difficult, and rate of response in most cases is very low. So you have to basically think of a large sample so that ultimately you're able to come up with responses from as many as of them and come up with right conclusions. So how many people should I be serving? That is another issue. Now the size of the sample affects the reliability and the validity of the results, and so it's very important that you choose the sample very carefully. Also, the sample must be truly representative of the universe. If you want to draw out valid generalizations and valid results and want to finally come up with generalizations, very important that you have a proper sample size. The third thing which we speak of is a sampling procedure. How should the sample be chosen? Now, there are two ways by which you can choose a sample: probability sampling and non-probability sampling. In probability sampling, each and every unit in the population has an equal chance of being chosen in the sample. Examples could be in the form of simple random sampling, systematic random sampling, or stratified random sampling, or cluster random sampling. But in non-probability sampling, every unit in the population does not have an equal chance, and it all depends upon the judgment of the researcher or the convenience of the researcher. So, the different types of non-probability sampling are in terms of convenience sampling, judgmental sampling, purposive sampling, quota sampling, or snowballing. So, these are different kinds of sampling techniques which can be used. Now, we come to the fourth constituent of the research plan, which is in terms of the contact methods for data collection. So, are the respondents could be to be contacted on telephone, or are they going to be contacted personally, or are they going to be contacted postal through postal mail or through email. So, now each of the different methods has its own, or each of the different methods has its own advantages and disadvantages. To start with, personal interview, if you want to contact them personally, it could be either in the form of interviews or it could be in the form of schedules. So, here the researcher contacts the respondent, interviews him, he could provide him with a questionnaire and will assist the respondent fill up the questionnaire. Here, this is what we call as a schedule. Okay, so when the researcher assists the respondent in filling up the questionnaire, we call it that kind of a questionnaire is called a schedule. So, the researcher could personally contact the respondent, interview him, or help him fill up a questionnaire in the form of a schedule. This particular method of data collection is very versatile, very flexible. Interview, again, the interview could also be structured or unstructured. In the structured interview, the same questions are asked to all of the respondents who are interviewed. But in the unstructured one, a general discussion starts between a respondent and the researcher, and as and how the discussions proceed, as and how the communication or the dialogue between the both of them proceeds, newer and newer questions are raised, different kinds of questions are raised, and different insights are gained. So, the issues come up for discussion as the interview is on. Now, as we said, interview could be structured, where questions are structured and very predetermined, or unstructured. In both cases, this particular method is highly flexible, very versatile, and most successful in terms of research, because if the respondent if there is ambiguity with a question, or if the respondent needs any kind of a clarification, the researcher is always there to help him. Researcher can also gain a lot of insight in this manner. Okay. Advantages: it is flexible, versatile. Also, incomplete responses and questionnaires can be followed up. Response rate is much higher. When you talk of sending questionnaires via postal mail, rate of response is very high, but in case of personal interviews, rate of response is very, very high. Only problem and only disadvantage with this kind of a method is that it's highly time consuming, and it also could suffer from biases and distortions, both at the respondent's level as well as at the researcher's level. The second kind of method is in terms of telephonic interviews. So, here it's similar to interview, but the difference is that the respondent is interviewed over telephone. Advantages: it's a very flexible and versatile tool like personal interviews. Detailed questions can be asked from the researcher. Large number of researchers can be reached in a short period of time. You can cover larger samples over across wide geographical territories. Data can be collected quickly. Rate of response is also high, and any kind of incomplete or responses and questionnaires could be followed up. But again, the disadvantage here is that it can only work if your call is short. You need to be very meticulous in planning in a manner that your length of the call is very short. Also, sometimes the respondent refuses to comment, okay, does not want to give any responses, and he also may end up giving responses which need not be true and may be incorrect. Also, because you're on telephone, you don't see or you can't see the person the other end, so you never know whom you are actually speaking to. Are you speaking to the right person who's giving you the right answer, or is somebody else proxying for him? So, this is a problem with telephonic interviews. Then you have a questionnaire by post here, where the researcher along with the questionnaire sends a self-addressed stamped envelope and to the respondent. Advantages that it's a highly structured and standardized tool. Because the question is standardized, and is used on a scale, it can be measured, it can be scaled. It's free from, it's more scientific, it's free from distortions and biases. But the problem with it is that it's expensive in terms of time and money. Rate of responses, non-responses. Rate of non-response is very high. Response rate is very slow, very time-taking, and it's not, again, it's not possible for a researcher to be actually face to face with the respondent. Then we have a questionnaire by email. Again, online surveys today were very frequently used, where the questionnaire which is sent via postmail is now sent via email. Okay, so the same advantages and the same disadvantages which we see with the questionnaires by post also hold good for questionnaires by email. The third stage in consumer research is collecting data. So, data is collected by the researcher both from primary and secondary sources. He starts with primary sources. He starts with secondary sources and then moves on to collecting data from primary sources. And this is the most time consuming stage of research. However, with advances in technology, data collection is becoming easier. Then once the data is ready, the collected, the major question here is to analyze it, to interpret it, and the major question which faces a researcher is what conclusion should be drawn. So, both statistical and non-statistical tools are used for analysis. Mathematical models, decision models, simulation techniques may be obtained, may be used to obtain results. Case studies may also be developed. Okay. So, descriptive data analysis will use tools like parametric analysis, central tendency, dispersion, or it could, descriptive analysis could also use graphical method in the form of the bar chart, the histograms, the line graphs, the pie chart, or a tabular method in the form of frequency distribution tables. Inferential data analysis is used for testing of hypothesis, where you can use the interval or the ratio scale that qualifies for parametric tests, and the nominal or the ordinal scale which qualifies for non-parametric tests. So, parametric tests are through t-test, z-test, paired sample t-test, independent sample t-test, and non-parametric tests are through the chi-square, the Mann-Whitney, or the Kolmogorov-Smirnov, etc. So, finally, the researcher has to prepare a report and should present the findings to the to the marketing team. The report should actually comprise a summary or the abstract, the research problem, the objectives of research, the methodology he has followed, his findings, his conclusions, his recommendations, and the limitations of the study. The report should be very short, precise. It should always be addressed with a solution. Limitations should be clearly spelled out. Recommendations should also be provided or clearly delineated, and the report should also follow a presentation, preferably a oral presentation assisted by audiovisual means, so that through a clear presentation, things which are spelled out in the report are gotten clear, people are more clear with them, and in case there are any queries, the researcher could basically answer those queries with a presentation. Now, this finishes our module 2, which was the market research and consumer behavior. But before we conclude, let us speak about a few references. Kotler and Keller, Marketing Management, Pearson; Loudon and Bitta, Consumer Behavior, Tata McGraw-Hill; Peter and Olson, Consumer Behavior and Market Strategy, McGraw-Hill; Schiffman and Kanu, Consumer Behavior, Prentice Hall; and Wells and Prensky, Consumer Behavior, John Wiley. Yeah, coming to some questions. For frequently asked questions, maybe in terms of what are the different stages of consumer research. So, you start and discuss all the 5 stages of consumer research. What are the different types of research studies? So, here you will speak about the 5 different types of research studies which we have spoken of in terms of descriptive, exploratory, causal, correlational, experimental. Then you can also be asked how do you differentiate between primary sources of data and secondary sources of data, and differentiate between probability sampling and non-probability sampling. A short quiz is something which follows. A true false, for example, the objective of descriptive studies is to gain insight and deeper understanding of the object of study, the person, object, situation, etc. So, this is false. Okay, this is a false statement. Second, interval or ratio scale qualifies for parametric tests. Now, this is true. The two, fill in the blanks, the two data sources are dash sources and dash sources. So, primary sources and secondary sources. The two types of sampling are dash and dash, probability sampling and non-probability sampling. 3, the most commonly used type of research is that of, well, descriptive studies. 4th, dash are the most popular of all techniques for data collection as far as the field of marketing is concerned. So, surveys are the most popular of all techniques. And 5, dash research is commonly used in test marketing for pre-testing of product before launch. This is experimental research is the answer. Coming to short questions, name any 2 tools that can be used for qualitative research. So, it could be depth interviews, it could be focus group interviews, projective techniques, observation, any or all. Mention the 5 stages of the consumer research process. Define the problem, develop the research plan, collect data, analyze data and prepare the report. What is the difference between AS type and DS type? So, it is active and proactive, one which problem has arisen and other reacting before the problem has arisen. Mention the 3 constituents of a sampling plan, it is sampling unit, sampling size and sampling type. Mention 2 types of questions that are used in questionnaires where qualitative research is conducted. So, you could have different kinds of questions like semantic, differential, dichotomous scales, multiple choice, word association, story completion, etc. And what should a research report format contain? So, it should start with a summary, a research problem, objectives, methodology, findings, conclusions, recommendations and observation. So, this finishes and we come to an end of the session 2 on module 2. Now, I hope you have benefited from this session and it has been proper understanding. I hope that the session has benefited you, and we will be discussing moving on with this subject in the next module, which will be module 3 in the next session onwards. Thank you.